Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about design freeze and when is the right time to have a design freeze. But before we can really get into the time of it, we all need to make sure we agree on what a design freeze is and understand the concept of it in the overall concept of design controls. So we have this cool graphic here, but we're going to jump ahead to one of our graphics for actually displaying the design control process. And actually, I'll use this one because it's more linear. And unfortunately, this is a little bit small on the screen, but I'm just going to try to show you where design freeze is occurring. We have the beginning of the design process might be kicked off by post-market surveillance. You get ideas for improvements from your customers. This is what isn't quite right with the product. This is what we want to improve. We need it better. So you take that post-market surveillance and it becomes a design plan. It gets approved and you have authorization to go ahead and kick off the project. Hi, Alicia. Thank you for stepping in. Thanks. Anybody else that wants to say hi, you're more than welcome to. The next step, you create your design inputs. That's your testing plan. This is going to be the standards that you apply. What tests are you going to perform? What are the requirements? Then we come up with our design outputs. Those are drawings and specifications. And then we have a design freeze. And that design freeze I've got in this diagram right here. And the reason why and I can even think I can highlight a little bit here. So it's right in this location. The reason why it's there is because everything after that requires spending money on tests. If you are going to go out there and spend $50,000 to $100,000 on electrical safety testing, you'd like to have a very high confidence level that you're not going to fail that test and have to redo all of your testing and pay for that again. You don't want to sort of know, you want to absolutely know you're going to pass that. So one of the suggestions that one of the colleagues makes is, why don't you pay for a design review to have an outside expert, an electrical safety expert, come in and give us feedback on the electrical circuit diagram so we know whether we meet the isolation requirements, and also review the components that we've got in the system. Are they suitable or not? And he calls this an insurance policy. You're paying $5,000 for somebody to do an independent design review during your design review process and say yes or no, this is going to meet the requirements or not, before you go to the next step, which is the testing. And they would tell you, these are the things you need to change before you go ahead on the testing. So you just saved yourself or bought insurance to make sure that you're not going to have to pay for this twice. So $5,000 versus finding out the hard way, you got to spend it all again and spend $50,000 to $100,000. So that's part of the reason for doing this. There are other tests. If you're going to do an electrical safety testing, that's one plan, but we're going to do other types of testing, like animal studies or something that has to be done sometimes for performance testing. If you're going to do an animal study, if that's going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars, and not to mention these animals are going to sacrifice their lives for this testing, you don't want to have to do that twice because you made a mistake. So you should write up your protocol, get it reviewed and approved by an ICO committee, go to the FDA in a pre-submission and get their feedback on it before you even do any ordering of animals. Maybe you don't need this study. Maybe there's another way to do it. And if there's not another way to do it, at least you don't want to have to do it twice. Same thing on non-clinical benchtop testing. People will complain all the time, like, oh, it's so many samples. I was talking with somebody yesterday. They were asking, like, we normally do 95 confidence level for the sample size calculations for this study, and the FDA came back and said they want 95, 99. And that's much more than we usually see. But wouldn't it even be worse if you had to do that twice because you made a mistake the first time? So not only did you need 100 samples or more for your first study, you made a mistake and now have to repeat it again for a second time and spend all that money. So the whole purpose of pre-subs, the whole purpose of design reviews, the whole purpose of doing a design freeze is to make sure you're not doing this twice. And a couple other people had comments here. one person said, what a great topic it is. Thank you. And another person says hi. So hello. If you have any suggestions for future topics, let me know. And if you have any questions about this topic, let me know. So what about the question of when is the best time to do this design freeze? Well, it's before you are going, whatever test you're not sure about, that you're not 100% sure about, and you might have to repeat. That's the thing that you want to do the design freeze. You want to make sure before you go do that you have your design freeze. And if that means delaying the design freeze so you can have another supplement pre-sub meeting with the FDA, sometimes it's worth it. But that does not mean that you have to delay all testing. For example, you might have a surface contacting device for intact skin. The biocompatibility testing is very clear cut. You're going to have to do 3 tests, or you're going to be, if you're going to the US, you might be able to use attachment G and avoid all biocompatibility testing. But if you have to do the testing, you only have to do 3 tests: cytotoxicity, sensitization, and irritation. Just those 3. So you don't have a lot of biocompatibility questions. You might be able to do that early. You might also say, we're going to do cytotoxicity first because it's an inexpensive, short test, and we're going to hold off on the others until after design freeze. But the cytotoxicity test is worth doing early, way before design freeze, because we want to make sure that material selection won't cause any problems. And the cytotoxicity is a really good screening test. So think anything prior to the design freeze should be a screening test, something that, like formative testing and usability. We do formative tests, try it with a small group of people, do a dry run of our protocol. You know, if you schedule 10 people to come in for a summative usability test, and you think it's going to take an hour each, and it takes 2 hours each, you've got a 20-hour day on your hands, but you don't have the venue for that long. You don't have enough people to do 2 tests simultaneously in parallel, and the people that are supposed to be showing up for 2 o'clock aren't going to get seen until late at night. So your whole schedule's blown. So just sometimes going through a dry run to make sure the time and duration is right is really important. So do a little bit of screening tests, pilot studies beforehand, do extra supplements, do independent design reviews where you have a third party come in and give you feedback before you go on to that final V&V testing, so you don't have to do it twice and don't have your schedule all out of whack, don't have the wrong number of samples, things like that. But is there a reason why we might have to do 2 design freezes? And normally I would have said no, but I went and visited a client recently that was doing a class 3 device, and they reminded me of a scenario where that would absolutely be necessary. A lot of times when you have a high-risk class 3 device and you're doing a clinical study not just to prove safety and efficacy, you do an initial study just to show feasibility. And so you're not going to necessarily build out all the features of the product without even knowing if it's feasible yet. So those early feasibility studies that the FDA allows you to do, they're only limited to 10 patients. So 10 patients isn't enough to say, I'm done with my safety study. So you might say, you know, we're going to build a prototype. It's going to be feature deficient. It's going to have certain features it has to have, and anything that's optional, we're not building into it. And we're going to test it on 10 people and see how it works. If that goes well, then we're going to build generation 2.0 that's totally different. That's going to have all those additional features that we really need to make this a commercially viable product. But because there have been so many changes between version 1.0 and version 2.0, we're not going to be able to use any of the data from number 1 to support safety and efficacy. I mean, it's supporting data, but it's not really supporting it. We're going to have to redo all the testing again for the new version 2.0. So in this case, it's a high-risk device. We're going to have to get an IDE approved for version 1.0, and then we're going to have to get a second version 2.0 IDE. And because there's no similarity or very little similarity between the 2 versions, because the early one was a true prototype and the second one had additional features and different instructions, more complex, we're just not going to be able to do the same submission. We're going to have to do a brand new submission of an IDE for that. It's not just modification, totally brand new IDE. So you really want two design freezes, one before you do your first IDE and one before you do your second IDE. So that would be a scenario where you actually need two design freezes and you're going to have two IDEs, but it's before you do the expensive testing. Now, are you going to change any of your raw materials during that phase 1 to phase 2? Probably not. Probably all that's locked in. But other tests might not be locked in. We had a couple other questions here. For your summative usability testing, you usually get to have another design freeze as well. So that could be true. If you're going to outsource your usability testing to a third-party lab, and you're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on that, maybe you want to do a pilot study before that and have a design freeze before you're going to go to that. The FDA says, what version of the IFU did you use for this summative study, and how does that differ from the final version you're submitting now? If there are significant differences, they'll make you repeat it. So generally, I try to avoid having a second design freeze by having that usability testing very late in the process after my IFU is finalized. But if I'm doing a clinical study, I might want to move it up earlier before my clinical study to make sure I don't have any use errors during the clinical study, and it might not meet all my requirements for my summative validation, and then do a second one after the clinical study to meet the requirements for the summative validation. So I could see a scenario, this is going to be a much more complex one that I'm going to outsource. Maybe I'm making a blood glucose monitoring device, and it requires 350 subjects because it's a OTC study. Yeah, I'm probably going to outsource that. I don't have the resources. I want to make sure that's done right. So I might have a second design freeze, but I'm not freezing the design. I already froze that. I'm freezing the design of the IFU specifically based on feedback I've gotten from the FDA and other usability studies I've done, some formative testing. So you can always do a design freeze of any component of your outputs and say, we don't require this to be frozen in order to go do electrical safety, but we are going to need it before we do usability. So we can do formative usability testing to satisfy the electrical safety and then do summative testing for the FDA submission. So it is possible to split up your design freeze. You're freezing certain outputs so you can go ahead. But in general, the term design freeze was always generally met as you're going to freeze everything. And maybe that's a little bit too narrow view to have. Alicia asks, what is the summative usability test? So usability, for anybody that doesn't know what usability standards are or usability in general, usability engineering and human factors are generally used synonymously. You can interchange those two terms. So a usability engineering file or a human factors file, they're the same thing. If you do summative usability testing, summative human factors testing, same thing, but it's the testing that you do at the end of your usability testing to make sure that nobody will have a use error that will make the product not work right or hurt somebody. So if it can cause harm or it can hurt jeopardize the standard of care, then it's not going to meet the requirements. It's considered a use error. Now, if we want to break that down a little bit further, summative, you have formative testing and summative testing. Formative testing would be like a pop quiz back in school. The summative is your final exam. So it's the final test that we do before we submit to the FDA. Formative testing is what we do during development to try different user interfaces. Like, do we do a push buttons or a knob? Or do we do a remote control or a joystick? When you're testing different interfaces, that's formative testing. Once you finalize the interfaces and you're testing the whole system in the instruction for use, that's summative. That's your final exam. In terms of what is usability testing, this is you going through simulated use of the device, not usually actual use, usually simulated use on a cadaver, on a mannequin, on some sort of model. You go through the motions of doing all the steps in the proper workflow to make sure you don't make any use errors that could harm somebody or jeopardize the standard of care. But it could also be summative usability could be done in parallel with a clinical study. Your clinical study by itself does not meet the requirement. But if you have a separate protocol to be done in parallel with the same users and the same patients, then it could meet the requirements. But you just don't need to see multiple patients treated. And I'm running out of battery, so we're going to call it quits for today. And I hope this answered your questions about what a design freeze is and when we might have two or more. So if you have any other questions, put them down below in the chat and I'll answer them as they come in from our comments. Have a great day and have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.